So to help us understand where we are today, almost 14 years after the horrific events of 9/11 launched the war on terror, are Karen Greenberg and Bart Gellman. Karen is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School and the author of The Least Worst Placed, Guantanamo's First 100 Days. The book, which we will sell during a book signing after today's talk, examines the failures of the policies enforced at the detention center, putting a human face to the descriptions of harsh treatment. As written in the Human Rights Review, quote unquote, "We are unhappy to need her, but author Karen Greenberg is a hero of sorts for having gained the trust of the people she interviewed and for her respectful treatment of the stories they entrusted to her." Joining her is Bart Gellman, who many of you know because we like to claim him as our own. He's not only a graduate of the school, but he is a visiting specialist here and teaches classes at the Woodrow Wilson School. He's also, in his spare time when he's not teaching classes at the Woodrow Wilson School, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who's covered the issue from multiple fronts. He has extensively analyzed the impact of the war on terror on the National Security Agency, and many of you know he broke the Edward Snowden story in the Washington Post. So we're thrilled to have these two very esteemed people here to help us understand where we are today with the war on terror. Thanks.
So I've known Karen since way back in the 2000s, and we've been good friends, and I worked for her at the Center on Law and Security at NYU before she moved to establish a new one elsewhere. So I'm going to try not to throw only softballs here, but we're friends. Karen's got 2 PhDs, written more books than I can name now, in addition to the Guantanamo book, but certainly importantly among them, the torture papers and the Enemy Combatant Papers. The Guantanamo book is an extraordinary achievement, and I say this both as a policy person and as a journalist, because it's the first inside history we've had of its establishment and its running in its early days, that this dramatic break with the history of our treatment of detainees and how it came to pass. She did get an enormous number of people to speak to her candidly, I don't know how you do it, about what happened, and it's a true inside account that I think we will not see another one like it until many more years pass and papers become available, if ever they do. And I thought we should start there because it is the original order that created a big part of the shape of what was then called the War on Terror. It was Military Order Number 1 on November 13th, 2001 that established Guantanamo. So why don't I start by asking, what were the objectives and how well did they work?
Yeah. It's interesting that you ask that because no one ever does. Everybody assumes that the objectives were to bring these people to Guantanamo Bay to establish military commissions for them and to try them. The military order of November 13th basically says that the foreigners captured in the war on terror will be brought into the military system where they'll be detained and tried. So it's considered the military commissions order.
They may be tried. There was no guarantee of that,
Says
right?
they may, right. They may be tried, but it's often referred to as the military commissions order. And in that may be tried is the space of what leaves the space of what actually did they mean. So it depends on who you mean by they, because for the people who are on the ground that I write about in the first 100 days, these are the U.S. troops and officers who received the first Guantanamo detainees. And the story is what happens to them. They are told that they're being brought there for detention and for eventual trial. And so they notice after 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, that there are no efforts for anybody to talk to them about evidence for a trial. They're waiting for orders to build a courthouse because there's no structure that can accommodate it. They never get that. So in their mind,
just to be clear, you're talking about the jailers, the creators and early administrators of the whole facility.
Right, who were told at the beginning, just go down there, we don't have a policy yet, but we're going to figure it out. And you know, that if you're in the US military and you're told, just figure it out, it's not what you're used to. You're used to a structure, an order, a chain of command. And so they were left on their own. And they did think that there were going to be trials. But pretty soon they realized that this was really a place to house and interrogate people who might give information about the war on terror. And interestingly enough, when they moved these detainees out of Afghanistan, basically because that's what Tommy Franks wanted to do, General Tommy Franks wanted to do, and move them to Guantanamo, they were giving up something that most soldiers in detention or enemies in detention can give you, which is tactical knowledge. So if you round people up and you say, where's the next attack going to be, or where's so-and-so, you want them near. That's one of the theories of military detention. They moved them out pretty early on, and they weren't there for tactical information. They were there for strategic information. And it was information of a rather embarrassing sort, and really on the order of, you know, who is Osama bin Laden really? Who is he surrounded with? What languages do these people talk? When the detainees arrived at Guantanamo Bay, they didn't have translators for their languages because they thought they'd speak Arabic. I mean, the staggering lack of knowledge by the US authorities about the war we had just entered and were going to be in for a long time was so immense that any piece of detail they could get was important. How did people farm? What was the community life like? Seriously. As one of my friends once called it, it was really Gitmopedia. And so when you ask why did they establish it, it was really to have a basis of knowledge, some of it considered very important knowledge, which I don't think panned out, and some of it just regular nuts and bolts knowledge about who these terrorists were, who the larger world of terrorists were.
The troops in Afghanistan had local guides, contacts, fixers, so somebody knew these people are speaking Pashto and Dari and whatever else they're speaking. How did that knowledge not get transmitted?
I can't exactly answer that question, but I would say that it went something like this. The civilian Pentagon and the military on the ground, there was a wedge between them from early on, and it only got stronger and stronger. And the reason it's called the first 100 days is that it comes to an end after 100 days. And basically what happens is the Pentagon, Donald Rumsfeld, comes in and says, look, this is going to be our show, not your show. And the chains of command to start to go directly to him instead of through the Joint Chiefs on a lot of things, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm only guessing, but that would be my wise guess.
So you're focused on facts on the ground in Guantanamo. But let me pull you back, because I know you've studied this also, to the designers of this system in Washington. And a non-admirer of those people, who was then the State Department's chief lawyer, said what they were looking for was the legal equivalent of outer space, where U.S. domestic law wouldn't apply, where the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the Geneva Conventions, and other aspects of international law, none of them would apply. What were they trying to build, and why did they want it to be
First,
that way?
let me just say that that same lawyer will tell you that what was said to him afterwards was, no, there's more laws in outer space. We actually do have laws for outer space. So what were they trying, meaning what the policymakers, what were they?
Yeah, but why did they want to strip out all these other?
They wanted an environment in which they could basically not be beholden to the letter of the law under the Geneva Conventions. They wanted to be able to interrogate these people without having to bow down to just rank, name, rank, and serial number. And they wanted it to be a place where they wouldn't have an agreement with a country that might hold them accountable for anything they were doing outside of that country's structure. And so that's what they were trying to do. And as I said, they didn't have a policy. They were also looking for a place where they could figure out the policy as they went along without having somebody like Germany, which could have been another example, possibility, weighing in with their opinions. Cuba made it very clear early on that that they would not oppose the setting up of Guantanamo, and as one cable said, the earliest cable that gave an indication of this, don't worry, if any of them escape, we'll bring them back to you. So they gave the green light, and to find a country that could do that would be really hard. And so the law-free zone included the fact that Guantanamo in Cuba would give an expansiveness to that law-free zone.
So they wanted to take people off the battlefield and keep them off. They wanted strategic intelligence. They wanted the capacity to try them without observing all the niceties of U.S. Domestic law. How'd that work out?
Well, it's perfect. You know, it's been there forever. What better, you know, how much stronger an institution could you imagine? Okay, how did it work out? In terms of intelligence, it's very interesting. You know, in terms of the torture program in the rendition sites, black sites, the CIA interrogation program.
Which is a different thing.
Which is a very different thing, we think, even after this report. It's a different thing. There is a sense, a defensiveness on the part of the government of, look at all the information that we got from these guys at the black site. We haven't seen the same kind of defensiveness about, look at all the information we got from people at Guantanamo, even though there is some of that. And there were some people who were interrogated harshly at Guantanamo, and so, you know, how did it work out? If what they wanted was information, this was the most expensive way in the world to get very little information. If they wanted strategic advantage, even if it gave them strategic knowledge of a sort, the backlash from countries around the world is growing. You see that ISIS wears orange jumpsuits. They're making a point.
ISIS puts prisoners.
It puts prisoners in jumpsuits.
A very direct kind of quotation of the Guantanamo uniform.
We're imitating you guys. You want to treat your people like this? This is how we're going to show the comparison. And then what was the third thing I had said was for strategic? Oh, the courts, the trials.
To try them, yeah.
The biggest failure of Guantanamo, it's hard to say what the biggest is, but the military commissions, to my mind, have been an unmitigated disaster and remain that way today. And the cost of not trying the 9/11 conspirators is vast, and until we try them in some court system, I don't think the United States can move on from this period of time.
Well, remind us all, how many trials have there been in the military commissions?
There have been 8 trials. There have been 9 deaths. I always like the fact that there's less trials than deaths.
Deaths in custody.
Deaths in custody. There have been a number of overturned convictions. I think we're going to see more. We just saw David Hicks last week.
David Hicks is the Australian.
And one of the first. He was the Australian kangaroo skinner who went to Afghanistan by way of Japan looking for excitement, and was brought early on to Guantanamo Bay, and captured at the same time as John Walker Lind and Yasser Hamdi, who was also an American citizen, the only American citizen to be at Guantanamo Bay that we know of. And yeah, I forget where I was going.
Right. So, but we were getting into how many trials. But let's just go into the Hicks thing. He actually wasn't tried, right? He pleaded.
Right. He pled out.
He pleaded guilty to conspiracy for material support.
Conspiracy to material support.
And how come that got overturned?
Okay. So let's separate out this material support and conspiracy, because they're actually the 2 charges to think about in terms of what happened to Guantanamo. In a way, the material support is more important than this other charge that I mentioned, which is a standalone conspiracy charge. And basically what the courts determined after many years was that the charges on which many of the detainees were being used against the detainees were invalid, because at the time that they were charged with them, they didn't happen to be war crimes.
The law actually didn't exist.
Right. The law didn't exist.
Forbidding the conduct that was alleged.
And so the courts basically said, okay, well, you can't charge these guys. So this is you can't charge it. So that reversed some of the more famous convictions, like Hamdan, and and sort of took the teeth out of the past of the military commission system after a new military commission system had already been set up under President Obama. So that's the fate of those charges.
So let me come back and push back a little, as I promised I would. You named positive objectives for Guantanamo: collect intelligence, conduct trials, and so forth. It strikes me that it's possible that negative objectives were more important, and I don't know that you disagree with this, but it's something you've heard a lot, which is we've captured them on the battlefield. We don't just shoot them. We can't let them go because they're probably dangerous. What else are we going to do?
That's what you mean, the forever detainees idea, that we're just going to hold them until the end of hostilities. And now that's the biggest impediment, other than the military commissions, to closing Guantanamo, right?
Right.
And you call that a positive.
Well, I mean that's a negative objective. That is, say, it's the result. It's the least worst solution, as your book is titled. It's they don't have a better idea.
Right. They don't have a better idea, and the reason they don't have a better idea is because, just my opinion, is they don't know enough about the world that they're dealing in. Because to say that you're going to keep people who you don't have evidence on, but you know are dangerous. Do you know how many guards I asked, how did you know they were dangerous? And their answer to me was, they told me they were going to kill my family if they got out. That is not a way. My response to that was, were you ever in 5th grade? I mean, threats is not the same thing as evidence. It's not the same thing of guilty behavior. It's not the same thing as using a firearm. I mean, it's not the same thing. And so we've never really been told what the threshold for assuming danger was. In fact, there was a Princeton student here who in his senior year tried to use this algorithmic method to determine how they'd been let out and what the criteria were by going through a lot of the reports. And what he determined was the one factor that just didn't seem to play into it either way was what a danger they would be if they got out. So I don't know how this assessment was made, but yeah, this is the idea that they didn't know what else to do with them is okay if it's a year, if they review them and start to understand who they are and what they are. But the fact that these people have been there for 13 years, right? 13 years. 13 years and counting, and that many of them have never been charged with anything. Most of them have never been charged with anything, and nobody pretends there's evidence to charge them. So that to me...
Right, but that's part of the premise of the question, right? So you're in charge. I hereby bequeath you the power, and you've got detainee X picked up on the battlefield. There's no chain of evidence, chain of custody of evidence. There's no paperwork. The witnesses are in the ether, and yet, suppose you actually do have reason to suspect that based on the conduct on the battlefield, this person is an enemy of the United States. What are you going to do?
Okay, so the kind answer, if you were just trying to be a very good law-abiding official, would be to define the end of hostilities and to say, I'm going to keep them till the end of hostilities, and those hostilities will end at the following time. And that time might have been the death of bin Laden. That would have been one moment. It could have been the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, when the authorization to use military force for the use of military force ran out. There are specific points at which, I'm not saying they were soon, but you could have tied it to specific points. So that would be one thing I would do. Ideally, I would love to say that you either try people or you release them, or you have a logical date of release. I guess those are your 3 categories.
Right. Or by the way, where do you put them? Because their country of origin, Yemen or Saudi Arabia, doesn't want them. No thanks to the offer of repatriation.
Then, yeah. Like where do you put them? It wasn't a question of where we put them. You mean, do you let them go back? You mean at the time, did you let them just stay in Afghanistan, right?
Right. Or now they're in Guantanamo. Where do you put them when they have many passports and Yemen says no thanks?
Yeah. Well, does Yemen? Yeah. We don't want them in Yemen no matter what Yemen says, right? So we don't want them in Yemen. So we do exactly what we're doing, which is I think the Obama administration, in terms of releasing prisoners, has been extremely aggressive, and successfully aggressive about whittling away at these categories, including the forever detainee category. And I think that's what you do. And don't forget, and I read about this in the book, Pierre Prosper had the mission that Cliff Sloan, the most recent ambassador at large for solving these problems, had. And he resettled a number of detainees. I mean, under George Bush, 470-something were released, some very high
Right,
number.
so you go around the world and you say, hey, you owe us a favor, and
Yeah.
here's a few $1 million and take
10.
take a few of these guys and find something to do with them.
Yeah. The further problem of Guantanamo is that when they had the first 300 in those 100 days, they knew that they'd rounded up a number of people, and President Bush knew, which is why he started to release them, that they had people who were just, some of them who were just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, some of them who were traded for bounty because of tribal and family disputes, and they added 500 more. And so the problem, it was like doubling down on a problem you knew existed. So
we're 13 years later. What's the same today, and what's different?
let me just answer one other thing.
Yeah, sure.
You asked me what I would do. I would never have created Guantanamo. It was a mistake that once you made, and people knew it at the time, and once you make that mistake, the lessons of the war on terror, whether it's the black sites, whether it's Guantanamo, whether it's the surveillance policies, what we've learned is that once you make these mistakes, they are forever mistakes. We can't figure out how to get out of them. And perhaps the most egregious of them all may turn out, the most long-lasting, is going to turn out to be your specialty, which is the surveillance issue. So that's the whatever I did, I wouldn't have started Guantanamo. It was a
Right.
wrong idea. Okay, now what was your other question? Where do we go
Well,
now?
somehow, astonishingly, this many years into Obama's second term, when it was literally his number one promise, his first promise, his first order as president, Guantanamo was still open. But it's not the same as it was. What's different? What's the same?
What's different is that, in theory, the military commission system exists and is trying to try people. We can come back to that, to what's actually happening. What's different is that Congress has made it impossible now to really has tried to make it impossible to empty Guantanamo, and has gone a far way to being able to do that by making, under the NDAA, making it impossible to...
National Defense Act.
Yeah, the National Defense Act, year after year, making it impossible to transfer these people for any reason, trial, whatever.
Right, is this through the appropriations process? Thou shalt spend no money on...
Yeah.
Right.
And
it's specifically for the purpose of, you can't bring them onto U.S. territory.
you cannot bring them onto...
Under the jurisdiction of U.S. law.
And it's something that I think the Obama administration thought they might be able to counter this time around, and they failed. So, it's put a continuing impediment in the way of I don't know if they'd release detainees here. I don't think the American public has been educated in such a way that they would allow that to happen. But at least for trial, at least for detention, as they work out the issues of trial, et cetera, and release. So it covers that whole territory, yeah.
So as some of us will remember, Attorney General Holder announced that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, was going to come to New York and be tried in federal court there. What undid that?
Depends on who you ask. If you ask Eric Holder, he will tell you that it was Congress that was to blame. That Congress, just what we were talking about, Congress made it impossible. And in fact, there's some validity to that. If President Obama had acted quickly, instead of having such an intense, deliberative process, and had not waited for Congress to impede this, then I think he could have emptied Guantanamo pretty quickly. But he wanted to do it in this thoughtful, deliberative way, and you can understand justifying that, whatever the consequences are now. But I would say I think it's a different reason. I think the reason that the KSM trial didn't happen here was that the issues that surround terrorism trials that have to do with individuals like KSM who are kept in custody in black sites, it is impossible, or the powers that be inside the national security establishment and some in the Justice Department, not Eric Holder, thought it was it was really too difficult to try them in federal courts. And by the way, it's not easy. It's not easy to take people who have been tortured, who it's documented have been tortured, the evidence against whom comes from either their coerced confessions or from other people who's been tortured confessions. With Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you could argue we could have tried him for, the United States could have tried him for an earlier plot to blow up planes over the Pacific, the Bajenka plot, but that wasn't the road that the government wanted to go down. So what I would say is that the whole package of illegal, extra-legal, war on terror policies were marching forward in such a way that it made trying these high-level detainees, the 9/11 conspirators who had been tortured, incredibly difficult in court. And I just think there was a lack of energy and will to do that.
You know, you started off, almost one of the first things you said was it depends who they is. And it's something that I always tell my students here. It's so important to distinguish the agencies, the players, the sub-agencies. It's not one unified U.S. government, and it's not all the U.S. It's not all government. I had the impression at the time when Holder climbed down from the promise that New York City played a pretty big role in that. That Ray Kelly, the police chief, saying, "Well, you can have the trial, but I can't guarantee security," and the mayor backing him up raised the political stakes considerably.
That's right, and I mean, or let me put it that way, that's not wrong. That New York City dropped the ball on this, partly because Holder didn't let them know ahead of time, apparently, that this was about to happen, and so the reaction sort of came too fast, too unthought out. I think Schumer was a part of this, a big part of this as well. But I'm saying something else, which is that I think there was a sense deep inside. The same reason we're still, look how bad these military commissions are, and we don't even consider another way of going about this, right? That there was a sense that this was too heavy a lift for the courts.
And they're not bad on purpose, at least not anymore, right? I mean, so at the beginning, the idea was let's write rules that don't actually restrict us in almost any way. But that has changed over the years, and you now have some of the best and most honorable members of the military legal establishment running the place and trying really hard to come up with a fair way to untangle this mess, and they still can't do it.
That's right. They can't do it because, and it's not the problem that they're military commissions. I mean, it is partly because I think a federal judge could handle this. The federal courtroom, an Article III courtroom, civilian court could handle this in a way that had a little more clout from the bench, and that might make all the difference in this situation, but it's not going to change the evidence. So I want to just come back to this Holder, why we didn't have them point, right? So when no one was looking, President Holder and Obama moved a detainee from Guantanamo to the United States in June of 2009, Ahmed Gailani, who had been already indicted in the U.S. courts for the embassy bombings of 1998. And although he had gone and joined bin Laden afterwards, and this was a whole chapter of his life that wasn't part of the case, they tried him in New York. It was clearly a test balloon. It was after they moved him here and announced the trial that Holder said, and by the way, we're bringing KSM here. That's when the announcement came. The Gailani trial goes forward. Gailani had been tortured. He was at a black site. When he was tortured, he gave up the name of an individual who said that he knew what he was doing when he got the explosives and that it was explosives for bombing the U.S. embassy. And the question was, before the trial began, and this is in Manhattan, the question was, could this witness testify because Gailani had named this person during torture? And so he was discovered by the fruits of the poisonous tree, right? And so the question before the judge was, are you going to...
For the non-lawyers among us, this is the legal doctrine that if evidence is obtained unlawfully, then any other evidence that flows from that you couldn't have had otherwise, fruit of the poison tree, can't be used.
Which we now have being debated in court in terms of surveillance issues, 702s.
Right.
So So the judge in this case, and this is why I say I think a federal, an Article III court judge could make a big difference in these cases, said, no, we're going to exclude this evidence, which was devastating to the government because it was the heart and soul of their case, as they made very clear in fighting to have this witness come to be part of the trial.
I recall you went to that trial.
I went to every day. Of this trial.
What was the result?
The result was that the jury acquitted him on 283 of 284 counts. And they acquitted him of the murders, which was the real issue. Most of those counts were for the 224 people that had been killed in the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. And it was interpreted by many inside the government as devastating loss, even though it wasn't a loss. The judge, when it came to sentencing months later, gave him life imprisonment without parole, which I think certainly shocked the jurors. I can be sure, they were anonymous, so you can't track them down as easily. But it was a warning sign to the entire system, and it was after that, in the middle, they knew where this was headed, that Holder said, okay, whoever my opponents are on this, they win. I can't fight this anymore. That's how I see what he did.
Right. Now, tell me if I'm misrecalling this. When Holder was asked about, when he had announced the intent to try KSM in New York, and he's asked, well, what if he's found not guilty? His answer was right up to the line of saying, well, not guilty doesn't mean we release him.
No, Holder said we're going to find. No. You're probably right because you're like. But here's how I remember it. I remember Holder saying, and he got a lot of quizzing for it. Don't worry, he's guilty. He's going to be convicted. That's what he said. And then everybody was like, "What did you just say? You're the Attorney General of the United States. There's supposed to be a presumption of innocence." And but when
I think it went beyond
when
that,
Judge Kaplan wrote, you're probably right. I just don't. When Judge Kaplan wrote the witness, when he wrote. There were two things, the speedy trial and the witness exclusion, and when he wrote them, he wrote, and this was the moniker, he said, don't worry, if he's acquitted, we'll find a way to keep him in custody. It's assumed that there'll be a way to keep him in custody. Basically return him to the Guantanamo-style detention is what we read. And it was a shocking moment in the courtroom when Judge Kaplan handed out that document. So Holder may have said it, and it just got wiped out in my mind by Kaplan, but yeah.
So we're in this place where, at least for some number of detainees, the Obama administration feels completely handcuffed. Can't try him in military commission, can't try him in the United States, can't release him, can't find anyone who will take him, wants to close Guantanamo, and there was a view being propounded for a while, and I don't know what you think of this, that because they are so desperately handcuffed on Guantanamo and on the subject of detention in general, this is a substantial part of the explanation for why Obama seems so enthusiastic about drones. That the new least worst answer is to kill them, because you don't want to take a chance of capturing anybody, because what the heck are you going to do with them when you do? Do you think that's true?
I think there is a relationship between a detention trial and the difficulties they have posed to this country and the ramped up use of drones. Absolutely. I think, and let's include just in drones, targeted killings, so that it's not just drones, but it's also targeted killings, and drones are the preferred method or have been.
Right, obviously the whole U.S. Special Operations, you don't hear of them bringing back prisoners.
2008, last person to go into Guantanamo. And so there's the dance here is between intelligence equities and, does the country want so much intelligence from these individuals that they want to keep them in custody? Or are they better off dead as the enemy? And so this is, to me, a very frightening moment, and by which I mean, the last, since Obama took office, a frightening moment about the future of how we think about the purposes of a judicial system, whether it's military or civilian. Because if in the back of your mind, if it's just too difficult and it has been difficult, to detain and interrogate and try these people, then what do we need them for? And the best example of this is Anwar al-Awlaki, a US citizen who was killed in an intentional drone strike in September of 2011 after bin Laden had been killed, which I think is important to that story. And think about who would have information that we'd want to know, that the intelligence community would want. The person who stood at the intersection between the United States and Al-Qaeda, the person who was the spokesperson for Al-Qaeda, the person who was alleged to have been involved with inspiring Hassan, with helping Abdul Muttalib, with a number of individuals, the underwear bomber, a number of individuals that he was alleged to be instrumental in coaxing them towards terrorism. Wouldn't you want that person in custody if there was somebody you wanted to learn about? So you asked me if there's the trade-off here. The trade-off is between how much do we want, the country want intelligence-wise, and how much is it just more important to get rid of the person?
And how much are they absolutely flummoxed by the prospect of holding a person?
Completely.
And the intelligence equities have lost every time, right? I mean, I don't know of an exception at this point.
Meaning what?
Meaning that they're not trying to capture people and they're not capturing them.
No.
There's some field interrogation, but other than that,
no, we don't hear about it anymore, and you don't hear because it's not the way of going about this war anymore. It used to be a war about intelligence. Now, the other side of this is not just drones. The other side of this is how much intelligence is now surveillance intelligence, and how much did opening up, and we don't have to get into all this, but how much did opening up the possibilities for more surveillance, more worldwide surveillance, more domestic surveillance mean that intelligence was easier to get in those ways than putting a person in a room and asking them questions? And so it's not, all these things are of a piece that tell us that we're really in a much different cosmic environment than we were prior to 9/11. And a lot of it has to do, not just with bin Laden or Al-Qaeda, a lot of it has to do with the new powers that have been unleashed by technology, whether it's drones or the internet or whatever it is. But we're in a different ballgame, and detention and interrogation seem like they belong to another century, which, by the way, they do. The 16th. But yeah.
Let's move from the 16th to and fast forward to now. There's a new kid in town. It's the Islamic State.
Oh, yeah.
And a very different looking threat. Is it a threat? Is it a strategic threat? Obviously, it's really bad news if you're a reporter or an aid worker who's under their control, and it's really bad news if you are on territory that they control and you don't conform to their ideology and don't submit power. But are they a strategic threat to U.S. interests here or overseas?
It's an excellent question, and one that's probably above my pay grade, but I'll take a stab at it. The power of ISIS, in addition to a lot of demonstrating that they are willing to be brutal, is the power of social media and the power of the internet. So what does it mean that they are a strategic, what does it mean that they would harm American national interests? It's hard to see how that would happen. But that doesn't mean that they're not something to reckon with and to think about and to deal with. They are not Al-Qaeda. They are and they see themselves as the inheritors of the part of bin Ladenism that emphasized the caliphate. And so their danger really is to sucking up a lot of youth that they're attracting from around the world to be there. Is that dangerous to us? Only if they come back, and if you read what these kids are writing and what they're saying, because a lot of them are young, really young, like 20 and under type of young.
Is it a fair distinction that core Al-Qaeda wanted to smite the enemy and drive us out of Islamic territory, and ISIS wants to rule it?
That's right. And they really want territory. They want that caliphate. They want that part of bin Ladenism that has territory and land, and they want to own it. But wanting and doing are two different things. And it remains to be seen what this will morph into. And I think there was a fight, as you know, starting in 2005 between the renegade elements of al-Qaeda in Iraq and al-Qaeda Central about not doing things like this, not being too brutal, not doing these beheadings, not doing that. It was an explicit policy divide. And al-Qaeda Central, Zawahiri's point, who's now in charge of al-Qaeda, his point was, this is going to alienate the whole world, don't do this. And they were like, no, this is the wave of the future. And now we see that this is the tactic used to gain attention. They've gained attention. There's no doubt. They've gained attention, and they've gained a lot of drained up, almost like a magnet, attracted a lot of foreign fighters. What that will mean in the long run, I really don't know. I do think, however, that a lot of these people that they're attracting want to go there, meaning they want to migrate. And the real worry about al-Qaeda and individuals, let's say you ask about American interests, individuals who wanted to go from here to al-Qaeda, and we worried that they would be trained and they would come back. The little bits that we know about these individuals that are attracted to ISIS, they're not talking about coming back. They want to live in a Muslim society, in a Muslim community, and they want to serve it. And that service can include fighting and can include a whole array of activities, which is jihad in its largest form. So,
one of the criticisms of the U.S. domestic reaction after 9/11 was what a thinker that I admire, Bruce Schneier, called security theater, which is you signing a register when you walk into a building in front of a guard who's not paying attention and show no ID, but you're safer now because you've been registered, and you go through fancy and fasten your gadgets to get into an office building or an airport, or they don't let you stand on the platform of the train until they say so, because that's supposed to be good for security. Is ISIS specializing in insecurity theater, threat theater, by leveraging killing of one Jordanian pilot or half a dozen Westerners in the most spectacularly brutal way to send a message? But what's the purpose of that message?
Well, if terrorism is about making you seem insecure, then randomness is the issue. And what basically these security structures do is make you think that you could only be you'd have to be a target, like the airport would be a target, the obvious things that would be targets. This just sort of opens up it could happen anytime, any place. In a way.
But is that, I'm wondering about that, because it's happening to people who wander into their orbit, right? And because they want to be aid workers, or they want to find out what's happening and report it. The 70s style of terrorism was to hijack the airplane that you might be on, or to bomb the shopping mall that you might be in. That's not what we're seeing from them.
Well, except that you're seeing, right. Well, what you're seeing are like the attacks in France and in Denmark, right? And
But do you attribute that to ISIS or ISIS?
Well, one of them in France was, right? And yeah, I think there's been this call out for some kind of violence. Am I that worried about ISIS? Is that what you're asking?
I guess I'm trying to figure out, because it does seem so patently offensive and repellent to the Western sensibility that they would do the things they're doing, what they think they're accomplishing, what they actually are accomplishing. I suspect it's recruitment, and it's playing on an old theme of humiliation, and that finally someone is showing strength to hurt us.
Yeah, and I buy your idea that it's part of the bin Laden message is don't come here, right? Don't come here unless you're coming here to join our caliphate. So I think, it remains to be seen. What is interesting is that the ISIS phenomenon seemed to appear overnight, and it really has to make you wonder, how come we seem to learn, even those of us who are, listening all the time and paying attention, and the government in some ways seemed surprised by the rapid rise of ISIS, and that's a little disturbing.
Well, remind us, the ISIS leader, was he not once in U.S. custody?
Yeah, he was, and let go.
Speaking of custody.
Yeah. No,
but only local, because right, there's no place to put them anymore.
Al-Baghdadi, yeah.
Right. We talked about the changes of law and...
Well, that's not why they let him go, because we didn't have a place to put him.
Why they let him go?
I assume, and you assume they let him go because they thought that he wasn't worth keeping for whatever reasons, but it wasn't because they couldn't. I mean, there are still prison facilities in a variety of places.
We'll talk about that. What's the prison infrastructure available to U.S. military and the national
That's a
security
really
apparatus?
good question, and I actually couldn't tell you like today what it is. I mean, for a long time, Bagram in Afghanistan, which was the original prison, right, has served for people from not just Afghanistan but elsewhere that we've held. But there's also
Meaning you'd capture
ships.
someone in special ops in Yemen and bring them to Afghanistan with no obvious jurisdictional claim.
Or you have there's always this option, it seems to be, of using ships. There are a number of people who have been brought on ships from the earliest days, but even here, like with Warsami, somebody who was brought into the federal system, so there are different places that they're kept, but in terms of an organized system, I'm not sure how the military would describe that right now, or the intelligence agencies.
And why ships? Extraterritoriality?
Yeah, a way of not, again, it's like Guantanamo better, where, look, this administration says that it's abiding by the laws of the land, right? Ever since, and before Obama took office, Bush backed away from at least the torture policy. So the idea is you put them on ships. There isn't a lot of press, among other things. It's a contained environment. And what happens on the ship, they can have the public safety exception if they want to do that for Miranda. There's a whole bunch of ways in which it just seems like a more controlled environment legally, and I think foreign policy-wise. And also, remember, with each one of these individuals, if they detain them, they have to decide what to do with them. Now, there's more of a process for understanding what to do with them, and who they're going to go to, where they're going to be tried, if they're going to be tried, and so it provides the space for that.
I'm going to let you guys join the discussion. Do make your questions, or I will use my mighty powers of the pen to cut you off, and try to keep it brief so that everyone gets a chance. And do please come down to one of the microphones here. Sir, there's a microphone just behind you. And state your name and your question.
Hi, I'm Jessica Byrne. My question is very specific about the Department of Justice. You mentioned about the problems trying someone in Manhattan at the SDNY. Are there other U.S. district courts that have been more amenable to that, for example, the EDNY? That's question one.
Eastern District of New York, right.
Yeah. And question two, do you think that Loretta Lynch will bring any changes?
Okay, so there are a number, that's actually a very interesting question, at least for me. There are a number of district courts that have become somewhat expert at trying terrorism cases. Obviously, SDNY, but EDNY, where Loretta Lynch comes from, is been doing a number of terrorism cases and actually has some of the more exciting terrorism cases right now, one that's jury's deliberating, unless they decided on my way here. Anyway, the jury's deliberating in a terrorism case right now, and they've been cultivating this expertise since the beginning of the war on terror. So they're very strong. EDVA, the Eastern District of Virginia, is the other very strong court. They had some of the most famous trials. They had the John Walker Lynn trial, the Moussaoui trial, I think the Abu Ghraib trial. I mean, there's been a lot of terrorism cases that have gone through that court. And then there are courts around the country that have handled terrorism cases just because of things that have happened there. And they include Chicago, San Diego, I can't think which district in Texas, but in Texas as well. But the ones I've mentioned, those four, maybe Chicago, EDVA, Brooklyn, and New York are the main ones. However, you do see, recently there was somebody who came into custody who's actually a very interesting terrorism suspect, somebody by the name of Abu Ghraib. And he, surprisingly to many, went to the DC District Court. And I take that to mean that in some ways the Department of Justice, which has a division that deals with these cases in particular, that there is a sense of wanting to strengthen the expertise more broadly, and that just having these focal points of expertise may not be enough. So it's possible, but so that, I think that kind of answers. And Loretta Lynch. Do I think it'll bring a change in terms of how we try terrorism trials? You know, not necessarily. I don't think that the Brooklyn courthouse does it that differently than any place else. So probably not.
She is, I think, by instinct, a little bit harder line than Holder from what we've been able to gather, right? I mean, fantastic anecdote in the New York Times profile of her. Some of you would have read it, which whenever she did a new hire as the United States Attorney, she would pose a scenario to, want to be assistant prosecutor. You've got a case, and there's an old woman, blameless, who saw out the window. She saw, she's a witness, but she's afraid to testify, and she's backing off. What would you do? And the answer she's looking for is Granny's going to jail. That we will compel her to testify, and if she won't, she'll be in contempt of court. That sounds like a different approach from Eric Holder. Sir.
I have two questions. Question number one, suppose a 2016 presidential election is won by a Republican candidate, and they might bring the same people back again, like Dick Cheney and his colleagues over there. What do you think will happen to this Guantanamo situation? Okay. And number two question is, we see ISIS and Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they all must be getting funds from someplace to get started and to maintain their operations. With all our intelligence, US and UK, all Western powers, why can't we find the source of the funds and put a clamp on that using all our political power and financial power? It seems so logical, and I don't know why that's not happening.
Because you got the return of Cheney and terror finance.
And you are a breath of scary air there. Okay. It's possible they could bring back this regime, but it's not going to look the same. It's going to be a different kind of unacceptable stuff, maybe. For the reasons I said, the detention, the interrogation, these kinds of policies don't make sense in our current world. I'd like to say it's because they'd say, no, we learned our lesson, that really didn't work, and it was too much cost to pay. But it's just because there'll be other types of methods. And the second, what was the second question?
Terror finance.
So terrorist finance has actually, counter-terrorist finance has actually been one of the more successful and untold stories in the American counterterrorism effort, meaning that I think freezing funds, as opposed to some of these things that Bart and I have talked about, has been done rather aggressively and probably rather successfully in a number, with the theory of it's not about detention, it's not about any of these things, it's about following the money and then stopping the flow of the money. And so it's a combination of these things.
I've got one comment and one question on this. The comment is a reprise of what I said before and what you first said about they who, Republicans who, right? I mean, it is a bitterly divided party right now on many of these exact national security issues. And Cheney, for example, has made clear that he is very much against the philosophy that some of the candidates, especially Rand Paul, have been advocating. The question is, I'm a little surprised that you described the terror finance program as successful because, and I'm not up to date, but my impression had been that you can do a lot. You could seize and cut off and freeze a lot of money around the world, but the terrorism is cheap, largely speaking. The 9/11 plot was cheap, and that it's not plausible that you're going to stop, substantially all the money. What have been the successes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, because it's a very good question, because I don't really, I take them in some ways, you're right, I haven't given that more of a critical reading in terms of what actually happened. But what I do think the terrorist finance, what I think the successes have actually been, what I meant when I said this, have actually been more along the lines of intelligence successes. In other words, the terrorist finance program has been used as a way of understanding terrorist networks and unearthing terrorist context in a way that we see all these other things that are about detention and interrogation and trials, but the unknown story of the Treasury and the terrorist financing program has been that they are looking at funds to try to see what's going where. And so the stopping the flow of the money, as Bart says, may not be the most important thing about what they do, but following the money is. In terms of ISIS and who's funding them, it depends. So there's they have multiple sources of income. But I want to go back to what Bart said. It's not so expensive to do terrorism. If you look at the production values of those videos, you watch them, right? I mean, that could be, but we're not talking mega expenses yet. And so that's really a question. But there's a variety of things. Some of it comes from perhaps the Gulf states, some of it comes from Bitcoin, some of it comes from as you know, kidnappings. Some of it's, there's 5 or 6 different streams of funds.
Well, I think access is difficult, and so there's a lot of unknowns, but I have the impression that they're living off the land quite a bit as well, right? I mean,
where they live.
You go in and control the territory, you impose taxation by whatever the definition you have of that, and the local resources are yours.
But there is this sense somewhere that they have funds, not just that they're living off the land. And I don't know how much of it, I don't think we know enough about what's real and what's not real about it, but it's a good question.
Sir.
Yes, Eric Greenfeld from Princeton Township. You mentioned briefly what it costs to send a Guantanamo prisoner elsewhere. Could you be a little bit more expensive? What are we putting out to transfer one prisoner to some godforsaken country in Middle Asia, for example? Could you give some examples of what it's costing? It's not just a couple $1 million, but
I know people who know that, but I don't. But these negotiations are intensive and extended, and U.S. is asking an ally to do something it really doesn't want to do and pretends to want to do even less than it does. And you can extract quite a few concessions, whether it's trade, dropping some diplomatic objection to something that country is doing. It doesn't have to be a monetary. Yeah, but I think it's considerably more than a few million. What do you know about this?
No, not a lot of it's totally public and transparent, right?
Meaning none of it is.
Yes, that's what I meant. And so, but you do get the stake that these are high-level deals. And one of the reasons you get that stake is how long it takes to make them. These are negotiations that, this is my impression, that they go on for quite a while before they actually come to some kind of resolution. And it's what they call creative diplomacy. So I don't know what the price tag is, but I don't think it's low, as Bart says. I don't think it's low.
Was it the Bahamas or Bermuda that they tried to draft? Yeah, and they almost had it, and I think, the British objected, right?
I think that's right.
Well, also, right, but that's a different case than I was thinking, but I was thinking about a different case.
Thanks for your interesting comments. In view of the recent rapprochement with Cuba, one of their demands is to close Guantanamo. I'd like your comments on that. And why is the recidivism rate of Guantanamo detainees that are let loose so very, very high? Thank you.
That's an important question we didn't cover. Was the assertion by people who oppose closing Guantanamo that you let people go and they return to the battlefield. So what do we know about the recidivism rate as you described?
We know that the recidivism rate is calculated and has been calculated in the past to include both those who have been proven to return to terrorism and those who are suspected of returning to terrorism. That's the first thing. We know as well that the range of, because that's a gray area, that the range of guesses about this by the US government have ranged from 12% to a fraction of that, which is what the Obama administration is claiming, that their recidivism rate is way lower than the Bush recidivism rate, which I think is somewhat fascinating. Clifford Sloan, who just left office as the person responsible for relocating the detainees and being in charge of helping empty Guantanamo out for the last 18 months, wrote a wonderful letter to the Times, I think in January, talking about how these statistics are read. So what I'm saying is based on that and a few other things. In general, what you mean by recidivism, a lot of the defense attorneys for the detainees would say, what recidivism? We're not talking about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's not going home anytime soon. But what recidivism? They didn't commit a crime to start with. So the rate, according to the Obama officials, is extremely low. A number of individuals, also a low number, have been killed once they've returned home. But according to Obama administration officials, their releases, which are far fewer than the Bush releases, have not amounted to much.
And then there's a Cuba question on the table.
The Cuba question.
Cuba's declared, Cuba's demand, among many others, that Guantanamo close.
I think Guantanamo is going to be closed. Whether it's going to be closed physically or actually is the real question. Is there going to be some kind of rapprochement with Congress, and Congress says, okay, you can bring them here and lock them up forever without trying them? But I think what Obama means by closing Guantanamo is emptying that place. And by the way, not necessarily the military commissions may still be going on as well. But unfortunately, I think that may be what he means. So that, in other words, there is a way for it to physically close. Look, it's costing, every time a detainee is released, the amount per detainee of expenditure at Guantanamo goes up. And so the most recent estimation is that it's $2.7 million per detainee, which, looking at the whole budget of the place, and that's a hugely powerful amount per year. So the question is that alone going to make it so that there's enough of an argument to close Guantanamo? And I think over time, that's what's going to happen. But it doesn't mean close this issue of indefinite detention. And, yeah.
If you'll indulge me, I'll just do one quick follow-up before that. I seem to recall there was a period when it looked like the Obama administration was trying to find a governor who, with sufficient inducement, just like Bermuda, Bahamas, would designate a sort of high-security prison to be Guantanamo II, and then they would just put a big "We've moved" sign off, on the Cuban Peninsula. Whatever happened to that?
It got derailed. It got derailed by part of this "not in my backyard" movement that sort of happened at the same time. And they're still talking about opening that prison here. I mean, they come back to that. If they ever go anywhere, it's going to be there. But Thompson, Illinois. But it sort of imploded on this idea of not in my backyard and all this pushback. But
actually, and just one more. I promise I'll get right to you. This is a president who has famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it, expanded and extended the use of executive power, and who has not relinquished many of President Bush's claims of prerogative as commander-in-chief. Why didn't he just say, heck with you, Congress, you actually are not constitutionally permitted to restrict my commander-in-chief powers about where to detain prisoners?
okay, that would have been a huge overreach of power, I think, is what most people would have thought, that what Congress weighing in this fashion. And so I think there's a number of areas in the war on terror where Obama has chosen not to take that sort of king-like approach. He's reserved it for other things, like targeted killings and a few other things, but
Immigration enforcement.
right? No, but I'm saying immigration enforcement. That would be right. He's reserved it for other things, and this was not. Somewhere early in those 6 months of his first 6 months of his first term, he made a calculation that this was not going to be the highest priority. Healthcare was going to be a priority, and other issues, foreign affairs, but this wasn't going to be it.
Thanks for your patience. Please go ahead.
My name's Eileen Bird. I live in Princeton, and I have two questions also. So the first one is that it sounds really hopeless in a way for the people who are there now. And when you talk about closing the physical site of Guantanamo, but it just being moved to a ship or to Texas or something, do you see anything that could happen? Like you mentioned, Osama bin Laden or moving the troops home. Is there anything that you could see where possibly it wouldn't just be a virtual closing, but that we would actually release more people than a few here or there that we pay millions of dollars to get somebody to take them? So that's enough probably by itself. But my second question, if we have time, would be just, why did Cuba even allow us to do that? Like, I was surprised. I don't think of Cuba as being our big ally, and so I was surprised that they would say, oh, sure, put a prison here. We don't care. But
Well, it didn't quite happen like that. Oh, sure, put a prison here, we don't care. It happened more like we decided to put a prison there and then waited to find out what the reaction was going to be, and the reaction was. But the kind of interesting story that I discovered when I was writing this book was how lax the relations between Cuba and the United States were on the island of Cuba prior to 9/11. There was the old stories about the standoffs on the border and people manning the towers all the time, and real conflict and real tension had really dissipated. And so there was already a kind of lax, this is who we are, just going through the motions.
Talk about who were the employees.
Oh yeah, so it gets less and less every year, but at Guantanamo there are a number of people who service the base who come from Cuba. So they come every day, they go through the little security check, they work there.
That was
they
one of the
make money
stunning
there.
things I thought from your book. I had no idea.
I know, it was really cool. And then they go back. And so that's, that tells you something about the way the island was functioning. And it's always an interesting thing when you hear something as, here's what the foreign policy situation is, and you go there and you find out, it's really something very different than we understood. So it fits more than you think.
whether there's any hope for the people who are currently in the prison? My first question.
Well, just so you know, I'm of the I think Obama's gonna do his best to empty this prison. I think the military commissions are going to falter forever, and that there will be a solution, but that it may not be inside the military commissions. I think that the forever detainee population will slowly get whittled away as other dangers in the world, say, what would it be? I think the game changer on Guantanamo is going to be other issues, other dangers, other situations, and to the point where the increasingly irrelevant it becomes, whatever, I think it's irrelevance that's going to lead to it being closed, and I think that's how it's going to happen.
Jared Keeling, acknowledging what Barton Gellman said about the preference for drone strikes over capture, nevertheless, is the military establishment, the security establishment, interested in having means now to capture people and interrogate them and eventually try them based on the lessons learned?
Okay, so the United States is still arresting, capturing people and bringing them to trial. I don't know what the criteria are for capturing them and bringing them to trial, but there still is some impulse, certainly by the FBI and by the elsewhere in the Department of Justice, but it's a calculation. It's not an automatic as it was before 9/11, and I think increasingly this conversation about what to do with them. It used to be automatic. You capture somebody, you find a suspect, you capture them, you bring them to trial, you try them, and you convict them. That's what happened with terrorism suspects prior to 9/11. It's what the courts tried to hold on to after 9/11.
Right, this is an important distinction that you've just made with the FBI. Where there are people overseas that the U.S. believes it can make a criminal case in U.S. courts, the FBI is still very interested and has offices in embassies all over the world and sends detachments out to try to capture and bring back those people. So if it's someone who was involved, after the fall of Gaddafi, there were Libyans who had long been on the most wanted list, and the FBI was all over that. So they are capturing people when they want to charge them with traditional crimes. The difference is the military capture or capture under national security purposes.
All right. So, as you mentioned, Guantanamo Bay was a big issue Obama made in his first campaign, and then he mentioned it again in his second campaign, and he mentioned it again this year in the State of the Union. And I guess I'm curious about what you both think with regards to the whole war on terror apparatus, but especially Gitmo, but also surveillance and whatnot. How the administration has continued to make statements about we're going to do this without taking concrete action, and whether, as one thought I have is like whether if John McCain or Mitt Romney had presided over this, whether either the progressive or the libertarian wing would have let them get away with this in the sense that there's sort of an understanding like Obama's heart's in the right place and he's trying to do it.
I'll give a brief answer and leave you the last word. Presidents say lots of things, and it's not that they don't mean them, but you can't give priority to everything. And I think it's a sincere declared goal of the president. One of the reasons, among others, I think that Karen's talked about why it didn't happen in the first term is that he declared the goal, and then when you go into it, the bureaucratic politics of it, he didn't actually put anyone in charge of that as their primary job. And that became a huge problem because then all the other entrenched interests who had views on it got to run wild. It was initially in the hands of the White House counsel, Greg Craig, who also was in charge of vetting all appointees in the first days of the first term and advising the president on the entire range of legal issues and running an office of I don't know how many people, and it was just way too much for him, and no one else had that job full time at a high level. But please, and the other thing I was going to say is that in Bush's second term, he declared the goal of closing Guantanamo. The vice president didn't agree with him, but Bush said he wanted to close it. But wanting to and being able to figure out how and pay the price is two different things.
I think I would answer that question by avoiding the political, because I think, who knows what any other politician would do, because it's hard to say. But I do think that that closing Guantanamo in the real sense is going to be willing to step outside of some of these categories and just say, and the bottom line is that anybody who closes Guantanamo is going to have to be able to look at the American people and say, to the recidivism point, you know what? We've spent however much trillions of dollars on our law enforcement and our intelligence and our security apparatus since 9/11. And we don't think these guys are that much of a risk, considering the physical and mental state they're in after this kind of incarceration for this many years. But you know what? We got it. We got this covered. And that may sound naive and that may say idealistic, but that's what it's going to take. It's going to take somebody, I haven't found this person, but Bart would know, who's going to stand up to the American people and say, you know what? We've put a lot of time, energy, money, treasure, everything, blood into this, and you know what? We think we've made you safer. And until you have a politician that does that, not going to be able to close Guantanamo. So that's what I think.
On that note, please thank Karen. And thank you for coming.